Hello everyone, my name is Karina Pulaski, and today I am going to be presenting the first segment of the Impressionism time period, and this time period stretched from about 1860 to 1890. And I just wanted to include two portraits here. These are the two artists of the highlighted works, but I will be discussing those later in the presentation. Those are Claude Monet and Edouard Manet, not to be confused. So the first thing I've included is a video, and I don't know if it'll actually play in this recording. I can try, but because we're uploading this to YouTube, I don't know if that's allowed, so I'm just going to skip through it and include the link. So some key ideas here are that the Impressionists were, and this was defined on one of my resources, artists who rejected the official government-sanctioned exhibitions or salons in Paris, France, specifically, and were consequently shunned by powerful academic art institutes. So these were the French Academy of Fine Art as well as the Royal Academy, and those were in charge of what was considered good art and acceptable art in society, specifically in France for, almost 2 decades. It was a long time. This was a new industrial age full of revolutionary inventions that changed daily life and the progression of technology, especially in infrastructure. So there was a massive influx of invention. The market was booming, and so this completely just ignited the art movement in its plans for just modernizing and really revolutionizing what they wanted to do. And the Impressionist art focused on capturing singular moments in everyday life and in nature through the eyes of the artist, using stylized brushstrokes and experimental color. And we'll see later that this was both what they are praised for now and extremely hated for by most critics back then. I just wanted to include this here before getting into the historical background because I loved it. An art critic named Albert Wolff, after the second Impressionist exhibition in Paris, said, "Trees are not violet, the sky is not butter." And I included specifically sort of butter-colored sky to give an example of what he was hating on so much. And I'm pretty sure this might have actually been the specific piece he was not liking. But if I'm not mistaken, Wolff was part of the British Academy, and this was just not considered acceptable. So I just wanted to include this little timeline here. Again, it stretched from about the 1860s. All of them are kind of iffy, some of them 1870 to 1930, some of them, well, and this is for all of these movements, but for Impressionism specifically, some say it ended in 80, some say it ended in 90, but it was around from 1860 to 1890. I found this wonderful breakdown of major historical events. In 51, the Great Exhibition opened in London's Hyde Park in the Crystal Palace, million square feet of glass on a framework of bare ironing forming its walls and roof. The Great Exhibition celebrated the height of civilization to which the whole of mankind had risen. Then in 1854, after 250 years of almost no contact with the industrialized countries of the world, American Commodore Matthew Perry coerced Japan into opening its doors to Western trade. So we have these major exhibits of innovation, technology is progressing, and now trade is expanding on a more international level. Then in 59, Bessemer developed a new way to make steel that was much more efficient, much less costly, and he forced blasts of hot air through the molten iron to burn out impurities. Bessemer began using his new blast furnace in 59 in his factories. So now that there was new steel, this was a new way to build the bigger and better buildings, which later is mentioned in 1889. The invention of the electric elevator made possible a new kind of building for crowded cities, such as the skyscraper, and now these massive metros are popping up in France, and a huge part of why these are possible is because now steel is being included in this architecture. And jumping back, Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland, and in 79, Edison developed the first light bulb. That was world-changing forever, of course. In 1901, William Knox Darcy, British speculator, made a deal with the Shah of Persia, paying him a share of the profits in exchange for the right to drill oil wells. Again, the international expansion of trade and just the economy is booming. And then in 08, Darcy made the first oil strike in the Middle East. Soon his company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, controlled the industry in Iran. So it's kind of exhausted, but this, I feel like, even though it's a lot to have on the slide, it really broke down some of the huge, huge historical events, and those were important to have. So one of the major works, and this is not a highlighted work, I have the major works and the highlighted works. This is a Camille Pissarro. This piece is titled The Boulevard Montmartre at Night, 1897. It's an oil painting on canvas, and it's currently located at the National Portrait Gallery. Patronage and artistic life. During the dawn of Impressionism, the art was costing artists more money than it made them. Supplies were innovative but expensive to produce and obtain. So now they were making it a little more possible to get a wider range of hues and colors, specifically in oil paint. And now that oil paint was the medium of choice, companies were really playing off this high demand. And I mean, they were very efficient. Like, they were coming in smaller tubes, they were collapsible, they were more transportable, which was ideal for the Impressionists, considering most times they were taking their supplies outside to working from life, going out into the streets. They wanted something a little more portable, so this was very accessible to them. But now that they didn't have such toxic chemicals in the paints, the replacement for the toxic chemicals was much more expensive. Healthier, but more expensive. So in the beginning, the Impressionists were definitely spending more money than they were making. And the reason they weren't making that much money is because they really didn't have that many supporters. I mean, they received more criticism, and this is why I put it here, due to its disapproval from the Royal Academy of Art, who ruled the art world in France, as well as the French Academy of Fine Arts. So much of this art was very allegorical, deep symbology, very religious, very realistic, very idealistically beautiful, and many times still in the old courtly terms in the Renaissance, courtly beauty. Very, very stylized in that way. But that's the opposite of what the Impressionists were trying to do. The Impressionists were much more secular and not really telling a story. They were trying to capture a very specific moment in time. They were working from natural life, everyday life, no deeper meaning. It was essentially the same feeling that's evoked when you look at a photograph. One moment in time through the eyes of the artist. So then later, a collector and proprietor named Paul Durand-Ruel bought immense amounts of artwork, first from Claude Monet, in support from the Impressionists' radical ideas. And after Monet's landscaping friend introduced them, he brought them to the gallery and introduced them. This changed the support for Impressionist art immensely. And Ruel went on later to buy so much Pissarro and Degas and Monet, and he expanded his Impressionist revolutionary collection greatly. So the Impressionists continued making art as a form of exploration, as well as revolution, against classical idealized notions of beauty. They were rebels. Another major work I highlighted here is by Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Luncheon of the Boating Party, 1880 to 1881. It's, again, an oil painting, and this is part of the Duncan Phillips collection. This is part of the DuPont Circle neighborhood, and of course there was a huge section of the Phillips collection at the Milwaukee Art Museum currently, but right now this is in Washington, D.C. Artistic innovations. Impressionist artists relied primarily on natural light and painted from life. So they were, even though the light bulb was now invented, they were not looking to artificial light because that was not going to register in the viewer's eyes and give the artist the information they needed to convey this feeling in that moment that they were trying to capture. So when the sun moved and the light shifted, when they were sitting outside painting, Monet, for example, when he was sitting outside next to a pond painting the water, if the light shifted even a little, the artist would stop and wait until the next day. So therefore, a lot of those brushy, soft, wispy, almost quote-unquote sloppy movements came from their quick application of paint to quickly try to capture the moment. And as I mentioned before, going back, new access to color ranges that were less toxic. Paint now comes in smaller, more portable tubes. Impressionists pushed color boundaries, employing their values, and truly understood the different effects these values had on the viewer's eye. A quote, "The late 19th century artists studied and embraced scientific research into color and light, which informed the development of photography as an artistic medium." Another major work I included, this is an Edgar Degas, The Ballet Class. This was a painting that he worked on for 3 years, 71 to 74, and it's currently at the Musée d'Orsay in France. So this is my first highlighted work. This is an Edouard Manet. This is oil on canvas. This was considered to be a very controversial art piece, especially because the woman is sitting there nude, and she's looking straight into the eyes of the viewers, yet there are these two men who are conversing and kind of in their own little world, and they are fully clothed. There's also some conversation about the symbolism of there being this spilled fruit, possibly impurity. All of her clothes are strewn about on the ground. So this was considered a very socially subversive piece. But for the elements, there's great contrast in color. You have this bright, almost blinding skin tone in comparison with the very dark clothing of the two men sitting next to her. And then the dark trees and the dark shadows. Yet there's this bright light in the front from her. The men are dark. The setting is quite dark. But then as you go deeper into the back, you see, again, another female figure who is very light, and then this bright, shining sky and ground behind her. So there's so much depth. The balance of the figures is also very strong. The male figure on the left, his clothing is extremely dark and weights him down, but that balances out with the blaring brightness of the skin of the woman. And I find it very interesting, the negative space that they use. It creates a lot of movement. I mean, the first thing, obviously, you're going to look at is the woman figure. She's so bright. And then you move over to the right, or at least I do, because of these lines that almost form from the man's right arm pointing towards the other man, and then his two legs pointing towards the woman. All signs point to her. Even the woman in the back, her arm is reaching down towards the middle of the canvas, so it's a very centralized composition. And here again, I included a video, and I'm going to skip past that. The link is right here. And I included another video. This is just a short biography about Claude Monet, who is the artist of the next highlighted work I'm going to be discussing. The first highlighted work is one of the pieces in the Water Lilies series. So this isn't one specific painting called Water Lilies. This was an entire series of, I want to say, about 16 or 17 paintings. It's oil on canvas, and this one was done in 1906, so this one was done later in his life. The piece, I feel, engages in an optical push and pull through layering varying cool tones to register as one fluid blue in the eyes of the viewer. If you look closer, it's not just one solid blue. There are purples, there are greens, there are actually even some oranges, which are not cool colors, but you see them all layered in a very flowy kind of, how do I want to say, soft but intense application, sloppy but extremely intentional. And then his use of these rougher white highlights to signify the water lilies and the mosses, all these kind of natural materials floating on top of the water, is really interesting. I also think that because when we think of light, or our eyes usually register light with warmer colors, when we see these warmer colors in the water, we automatically assume that they're reflections from the sun hitting a tree in the background. That is not actually shown here. It's just implied. So this is another piece, very different, but in the same series. This piece is called The Water Lily Pond, and this is an earlier water lilies painting from the Water Lilies series. Another oil on canvas. Here Monet employs blues and greens to act as shadows. Recognizing that the values of blue always, or almost always, mentally register as darker, especially against the warmth of the pinks and oranges in the water and trees, most will see the blue bridge as white. And I feel like that was exactly what he was going for, even for these whiter, sometimes grayish. When I lived in Florida, it was kind of like a light gray color, but from the willow trees that you see in the back, there are these big gray pieces of moss. And even that registers as a white. But if you were to look very closely, he uses purples and blues. So it's just really interesting optical illusion that our brain puts together this very realistic image. So in conclusion, the Impressionist movement revolved around a vision for a new perception of individual realities and the world. Impressionists, using natural light, physiological research on optic light registration, unconventional colors, and newly available materials, made art that aimed at the capture of an instant in time. This logic directly parallels with photography as a fine art form. The Impressionists were often criticized on their looseness, messiness, and work's departure from realistic depictions. However, this looseness held the deep emotion that made the movement so incredibly influential. It was so deeply expressive, and the Impressionists had a modern vision of evoking this feeling. And it's truly a multisensory glimpse of the world through their eyes. What it felt like for them to be sitting there painting that image, what it was like to feel the wind, what were they smelling, what was the warmth of the sun like, how cold was the water, what sounds were they hearing. So my personal critique, and this is a very blurry image, so I apologize for that, but this is an Edouard Manet, The Cafe Concert, 1878, oil paint on canvas. I personally love this piece because even it's already an art piece itself, but it's capturing the social just deep value in culture and excitement for opera and going out and spending time with others and seeing the city and seeing art and hearing the orchestra play, watching the operas, watching the ballets. I danced in I was a ballet dancer for 11 years, as well as a performer, and so my own values in patronizing these artists and just the roar and excitement of these experiences really translates through this. I'm also just impressed at how much movement is happening, even though it's a still image. The way that the woman in the left is looking down and she's seemingly smoking, and she looks like she's probably had a long night. And this elder gentleman, I don't know what he's focused on, but even though he's standing there very still, the brush strokes that Monet used are so extremely just vibrant and bold and expressive that it really gives you this feeling of he's about to move, he's about to look, he's about to flinch his hand. There is so much movement in the image, even though you are just seeing this still shot of it. The woman in the back is mid-action, taking a drink, probably of alcohol, and then in the back, and I can't decipher this completely, but it looks like there are dancers preparing. So these are possibly people in the middle of an intermission or waiting for a show to begin. So there's a lot of anticipation. There's a lot of contrast, which I think is very, very attention drawing about this piece. The very warm faces of the skin, the warmth of the alcohol against these very cold, dark backgrounds, the black suit, the blue dress of the woman drinking in the back, and then there's a blue glow on this person that I'm assuming is a dancer. There's a lot of balance. I find it interesting that you have on top of the man's head this very dark hat, but then below the very bright face, and then immediately, almost like a mirror image next to him, against the dark hat is the light face of the woman drinking, and then the dark torso section of the dress against the brightness of this man's face. So I find that very alluring about this. So the piece I'm asking everyone to do their critique answers on is a piece called A Bar at the Folies Bergère. This is from 1882, and this is an Edouard Manet. My first question is, where do you see balance in this painting? My second question, how does the artist create depth in this work? And thirdly, does this work of art draw your attention? Explain why or why not. And those are my references. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy the videos, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's responses. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.